chasing balloons around the desert. Can we talk about that a little? I mean, was this a peyote thing or was it some kind of science thing?
When I was in college, I barely made it through college, right? I was one of these students that was getting by with a 2.5 average, and they're always going to put me on probation and things like this. So one day I found I was going to go work for one of the big three in Detroit, working on cars, because that was always my passion, right? Was cars. So I saw this poster in the hallway one day, and it was a systems engineering course, space systems engineering course. And it was funded by NASA, and it was taught by this guy named Dr. Frank Red. And you had to apply for this because it was a graduate level course, and they were designing a Mars rover. And it sort of lit my mind on fire. And I thought, hell, this sounds like a lot of fun. I was always kind of a space fan, I mean, it was. I grew up watching Carl Sagan's Cosmos, and that really interested me. That's what kind of got my interest in engineering and science. And so I, went up and applied, for this in person, and knocked on the door. And this is Frank Red, who's a retired colonel. He, looked me up and down and kind of gave me that, and I was jabbering on and on about how I, just build go-karts and cars. And he said, fine, you're in. So I got in this course. And we were designing, on the one hand, a Mars rover, and then on the other hand, a balloon. So it was kind of a competing thing. And at the end of the year, we would go to Washington, D.C. To present this to NASA, and it was a national competition among all the big schools, Caltech, Georgia Tech, and Rensselaer, Polytechnic, and so on and so on. And so we went, and guess what? I won. And the thing that we were finally presenting to NASA was a Mars balloon. And the idea was, Mars has a atmosphere, and you could actually put a balloon there. Now it's like 120,000 feet at Earth. It's very, 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 very thin, made of carbon dioxide, and so you have to make very big balloons, very thin materials, and so on. So as a result of that, winning that, I got a internship at JPL. So that's the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. That's part of Caltech, that is a NASA lab that has made all the Mars missions and has sent all the stuff to the outer planets and so forth, Voyager and so on. And so, to me, that was a pretty big deal. So I went and did that. And the program they put me on was their own Mars balloon program. And what happened that summer, well, it was more than a summer. It was about 8 or 9 months I was there. We invented something called the Mars. And what this was a long titanium sort of flexible rope, if you will, made of overlapping cones that could drag along the surface at night and not get stuck in the lava and the rocks and things like that. Whereas the Soviets and the French that we were unofficially collaborating with had what I called a Samsonite suitcase approach, that the first time it would come across a hole big enough to swallow it, it would get swallowed. So this was sort of a small little part of my job down there, but it turned out to have a big consequence. And so we patented it, and the French decided to use it on their mission to Mars. So I went over to Toulouse when I graduated. That was my first job. And what was funny about it was I really didn't want the job, and they kept offering more and more money. And I kept saying no, and they offered me ridiculous money. And it was about $300,000 in 1989, which it's well north of $500,000 here. Now, it didn't go as far in France, but still, for a guy straight out of college, it was a lot of money. I was able to save a lot of money. So I went. I had to say yes, and I went. And so part of what I was in charge of the snake, part of the design, worked with the Soviets and under the French Space Agency. And then the Planetary Society was still involved, and they would host these. We would over here in the United States in the Mojave Desert, we would find Mars-like terrain to go test these balloons. So we had Mars-type balloons that were scaled prototypes so they could operate in the atmosphere close to the surface, which is much more dense. So they were smaller balloons with real snakes and real gondolas, and we would just let them go in the dunes in Southern California, in the lava fields, and and one of my jobs was to chase them. So I was the recovery crew. I was in charge of the recovery crew, and I'm telling you, that was probably more fun than I had ever. We got these big Suburbans from Caltech, with the big tires, because they were the geology department. They're used to going out in the desert, except they didn't know I was driving them, 50 miles an hour over the dunes, because what you have to do on the dunes, something that heavy, you have to keep going. And if you get the speed just right, you sort of glide down the lee side of the dune. And I had these two Soviet guys who were very high up in the Soviet space program sitting in the back seat. And every time we would go over, they'd go, whoop-la, and laugh their ass off. They just were having like kids, at the French government expense. So this was my part of my escape from engineering.
This has been Jeff Stearns, Connected Through Cars.